Dorman represents the kind of composer often criticized for his talent instead of a lack of one. The kind of music he makes often seems inspired by the past and infused with the new. It takes a lot of knowledge and skill to do the things that he does that some critics are quick to play the blame game if he doesn't do a better job. A brief review I read once claimed Avner often finds some beautiful or interesting phrases but fails to do anything with them, often divulging into something else entirely. This sacrifice of development for spontaneity leaves the listener supposedly asking the thought of what could have been. This review kind of ticked me off, even though in some sense I agreed with it. One of the funny things about composers and critics is that they often seem to be going in opposite directions. Critics want more emotion, development, and tonal gratification. The composer, on the other hand, finds it more worthwhile to experiment, as if living in a newly refined classical era. This generation of modern, let's just call it non-popular music, is difficult to describe, so much so that it differs among many, but one of the traits I've noticed among them is the blending of all kinds of musical genres and forms. The result includes tireless experiments in music that range from either the equivalent of a fun lab tour or the Eighth Circle of Hell. I often feel like the rug is to be pulled from underneath me when listening to Avner Dorman. I suppose it's not his fault, but his blend of Baroque music with that of the energy and technique of a rock band often lends itself into quick, unexpected notes and into the scary realm of the atonal. Thing is, I get what critics mean when they claim a composer misses their musical window of opportunity, something you could argue Dorman unfortunately succeeds in doing here, but I don't think he misses the barn as many times as others claim. Dorman, along with many other talented contemporary composers, are often tasked with the unenviable goal of finding something emotionally tangible through the constant experimentation of their sound and music. We're not living in the romantic age anymore. Subtlety is now king. And sometimes the best way for a composer to achieve subtlety is by pretending the idea of music with feeling never existed. Thus, intelligence, cold as steel rationalism takes over and allows Dorman to weave a complex mesh of neo-Baroque music rife with challenging counterpoint and concise rhythms. But no matter how hard you try, you can't take the soul out of a dude or dame. And if you're lucky, it finds a way to bleed in. Considering the jazz, rock, and ethnic intricacies on display, and infused in the neo-Baroque idiom, that doesn't take too long to happen. The first two concertos on this list almost seem to be a humorous inclination on Avner's part that the smaller instruments have something to say. The mandolin and piccolo don't normally pack a lot of punch, but they do here. The Mandolin Concerto is something of a frankly wonderful mixed bag. Dorman describes this piece as a kind of paradoxical, still energy in motion. The first movement is quite meditative for this reason, but it's not likely to interest you for very long. Moments like these in music often threaten to chase the listener away, since contemporary music has the bad habit of playing with silence. It doesn't help this CD's chances of sales when the very first track is just that, a sparse mediation on sound. But hold up! The second movement completely makes up for it. It's a fast piece that shows what I feel is another side of the mandolin that others aren't used to hearing. It's usually a plucky, fresh, and ebullient instrument, but here it's a lot more intense. The third movement is something out of Twin Peaks' playbook, with paranoid atmospheric sounds bound to make your skin crawl. The bass lurks in low, steady beats, whilst the mandolin becomes delirious and amoebic. The strings carry this strange energy, sounding like a bright light that crosses the reverie of the bass's darkness. It's very unsettling and aesthetically attractive all at once. The final movement essentially becomes the musical equivalent of a lava lamp. The mandolin is detuned, which is one of those contemporary tactics that might irk some people, but I liked it. I mean, that's one of the whole points of a concerto, to either glorify the instrument or discover its many other expressions and potentials. Neither route is inherently wrong, but when some people hear the word mandolin, they might be expecting a certain other kind of sound than what they actually get. The Piccolo Concerto is the most accessible piece on here. The first movement comes across fairly theatrical, but through the movements, it changes into something more panicked and infuriated. Leave it to a piece of modern-day Baroque music to show rock what aggravation actually sounds like. The strings fester and stretch, the piano throttles, and the piccolo plays its melodies like a two-faced beast, one meek, gentle, and worried, and the other threatening and repulsive. The former attributes of the piccolo are demonstrated most effectively through the very ethnic-sounding melody in the second movement, though at a couple points it carries an almost bluesy-like melody and rhythm. This darker coding that weaves around the more innocent and light ethnic qualities never fails to be ravishing. The watery bird-like trills of the first movement help the piece float with immeasurably effortless poise. It's altogether rather devilish, then, when the final movement betrays this flavor and divulges into a suspenseful rock and roll endeavor. Really, the piccolo isn't doing anything that different from the techniques and showiness of a rock guitar, but instead of sounding just as wild and cool, and I'm using that word loosely, it sounds as if it's reached an uncomfortable breaking point. Most obvious is the piccolo's scream towards the end, bound to remind anyone of a screeching tea kettle. I dare call it a kind of musical commentary if I didn't come off sounding so pretentious and forceful in saying it. Still, the edgy and rebellious sound of rock is unveiled for the frightened angst side it tries to bury, and all it took was a simple little change in leading instruments. I love it. The Mandolin Concerto might be the reason most buy this CD, but the Piccolo Concerto steals the show. The Concerto Grosso is a strange beast. I didn't like it at first. I must have been in a bad mood then, because it's terrific. There are a lot of atonal strains at the start of this piece. Dorman almost seems to be mimicking the riffs and headbanging rhythms of a rock band, only when an electric guitar does it, it's considered fun. Here, it's humorously likely to get tired eye rolls. Dorman then takes an almost nauseous-sounding melody and builds off of it in some rather clever ways. It sounds like the siren of an old paddy wagon as heard from a man tripping on LSD from the distance. If anyone in the audience remains after this point, they'll be treated with a beautifully surreal makeup of delirious strings and a fanciful, creepily detached harpsichord. The whole thing reminds me out of something from Twin Peaks again. Dorman wrote this piece with Handel and Vivaldi in mind, which, when listening to it, seems to be something of a joke. I believe him. The driving melody here is from a Handel concerto, and the second movement is where Vivaldi is at his most apparent, but Dorman happily flies the train off the tracks in the other two movements. Which is good. I don't want the whole thing to sound like something I've heard before, but the vitality to which I subscribe to Vivaldi is missing here, mainly because this is a minimalist concerto grosso, and trust me, those are three words that sound odd to almost anybody, since the goal of a minimalist concerto grosso is to use as many instruments as possible, while hardly playing that much either. Wait, what? The latter of the second movement before its sonic culmination and the final movement are my favorite parts, constructed out of drifting strings and more mundane melodies, played usually by the harpsichord or cello. These moments remind me of something out of Moon's score, with instances of bright, sustained string playing floating past simple, low-key tunes. The result is a kind of ghostly musical serenity that captures the very ambiguity of its existence. Surreal enough for you! There's no way to describe the piano concerto other than really fun. For all those cold, icy keys, the piano has a beautiful sense of depth, with notes and chords that allow you to sink and higher ones that make it sound as if you're suddenly ascending a stairway to heaven by tiptoeing. Such is what this piece does exceptionally well. I don't have much to say on it, though, only because my mind is too busy humming the first movement as I talk right now. The strings and piano harmonize beautifully, though, particularly in the first movement. Overall, even when Dorman gets weird, the level of intrigue remains high, and even when the music slows, a distinct kind of energy remains intact. A rigorous and eclectic body of work, there's something here for almost everyone. I wanted to knock half a star off this CD, not for any particularly important reason, just that the cover Naxos chose is awful. It's freaking paint supplies. You're supposed to turn the camera a few more feet and snap a photo of the painting, Naxos. Seriously, it's like they don't want anyone to buy these things. I highly recommend this CD to almost anyone. The Concerto Grosso and Mandolin Concerto aren't the easiest to get into, so I'd say start with the Piccolo Concerto and work from there. Experimental as it all is, it's ultimately worth it. This is more than just a science experiment, and Dorman is willing to leave it up to listeners to take what they will from it. I give it 4 stars out of 5, and my MVP pick is the Piccolo Concerto. It's easy to find, and it's worth even a pricey purchase to make sure it ships intact. Unless, you know, your local Kmart carries it. Take it easy, everybody, and be safe.